My other two panels dry for a good portion of the afternoon. I think they're dry enough to dry fit these together, and I already dry fit together the one with the panels I did the other day. It's pretty simple. I just put those 5 stretchers back on and sandwich it together, and now before I call it quits for the day, I'm going to take it apart, same process, glue on the tenons and the mortise, sandwich it back together, put clamps on all the corners, and let both of these sit overnight so they're nice and dry by the time I come back to it tomorrow morning. So I got these out of the clamps, they glued up really nice, and now I'm going to address the back side, and I'm going to be using this old tin. I use this on a lot of my pieces to put it in the back. Metal matches wood really well, and this aged tin will match the barn wood substantially well. It's an easy backer to use. And I bought a bunch of it once when I was using it for a project. I bought extra because it was at a great price. So now whenever I do one of these reclaimed projects, if the customer is okay with it, this is the backer I use. So the way I'm going to attach this is I'm going to route out a 1/2 inch groove around the whole perimeter, and then you could just cut that tin to size, plop it in there, and either put strips on top of it to hold it in place, but most likely what I'm going to do, since it's just the back, is take some nice industrial style screws with the pan heads, which look good, and probably just adhere it that way so that if they have to, they could easily pop it off. So to route that, I'm going to be using the jig I made. I took one of my fences off so this fence could ride on the outside edge and route this. Now this isn't flat, but since my fence is so long, I think I could ride it on the top of the legs in order to route the inside. We'll have to see how that works. That might not work, and I might have to figure out something else. But this is one of the main reasons I ended up making this jig, was to be able to route these inside patterns. A lot of times it could be a pain to do it. You have to set up special jigs, special fences. But with this, all I did was plop it on there, move the fence, and now I'm ready to go. Decided I didn't want to worry about messing up those rabbits on the edge of my cabinet, so all I did with this was I just made a much longer fence guide. This is over twice as long as the other one. It's long enough that it should never go past the span of the legs. I'm going to try that out to long fence riding on the legs for the top worked really well. The problem with the bottom is the legs are a little bit longer, so my bit lines up a little bit past my original groove. So I'm basically just going to cut this bottom a little bit wider and then clean up this front edge with the piece. And that's just because the slots don't go deep enough to push this further. So mine is completely modifying my jig, which I'm not going to do. This is kind of the easiest way to deal with this. Cut that groove, and I took all of my fences off of that router jig, and with that nice big surface area of my faceplate, I'm just going to go back in and freehand that extra piece off. I think I could squeak both back panels out of this one scrap of tin I have. With this stuff, since it's ridged, what I like to do is take a hammer and flatten out the ridges on both sides. It's a little time consuming, but it's much easier to put it on your surface if it's a little flatter than what it is. If you don't flatten it, the ridges will kind of stick up and it doesn't always look great. However, I'm going to cut it to height before I do that, so I have less to hammer, and these ended up being about 18.5 tall, so I made my mark, and I'm just going to cut this with a cutting disc and my angle grinder. So after I hammered it out, I just cut it to width, which is 13 inches, and it pops right in place. It actually fits in there quite nicely. You have to push it in, which is what you want. And then I'm not going to attach this yet because I still have to figure out how I'm going to do the rail system, if I'm just going to use traditional wood rails or metal slides for the drawer, as well as I have to put the bottom in, and all that stuff is easiest to do without a back on it. But if I forget to film it, I'm just going to go through probably 3 up top, 3 on bottom, and then 4 or 5 on each side, and they're just going to be these pan-headed screws like that. The round ones that look industrial, and when you put them in place, they actually match really well with the whole look. It's one of those times I don't mind having exposed hardware. So I'm going to do the exact same thing for the second panel. I'm not going to film it, and then I'm going to tackle the tops, and I want to get those done by the end of the day because the customer's supposed to be coming over tomorrow, and we're going to discuss what she wants to do for the fronts. And I think it will be easiest to see all of the elements together before she comes by. So there's those two cabinets side by side, and for the tops I'm going to be using these old fronts. These were actually grain bins that they had in old general stores. You can see they still have the maker's mark on them, Walker Bin Company, Penn Yan, New York. And these were actually really cool. They came off, I don't know if you've ever seen them, they were made out of oak, and you could pull them forward and take the grain out. And so she basically, the customer I got these from, she wanted the bins and she was turning it into storage and didn't need the parts of the actual working bin. She wanted just the fronts as doors. So I got the inner parts, which is all this tongue and groove poplar. Been saving it for years for a cool project, and just so happens to be just about the perfect width for these tops. So for these tops, she wants it to be flush with the edge. She doesn't want a traditional overhang on the edge. Now, I don't know specifically the timeline or the history of lips on tabletops. I'm assuming it hides if you're off square a little bit. I also think there's a lip to account for seasonal movement, so if things are shrinking or expanding and they're right up to the edge, if it shrinks a little, you won't see that edge, you'll still have a lip. So unfortunately, with newer designs and people finding stuff on the internet, it's not always conducive for proper furniture build. But as long as I tell a customer concerns, I will make what you want. So she does want this to come to the edge, and if I have the grain running this way, it most likely is only going to shrink going this way, so it shouldn't be a huge issue. One side of these already has a rabbet on it, which means I'm going to have to continue the rabbet to cover this whole piece, otherwise you'll have a weird mark on one side. So these are about 1.25 inches thick. So I still have my dado stick in my table saw. I'm going to put 1.25 inches rabbet on both sides of these panels. So the one nice thing about waiting for things to dry is I was able to re-square my radial arm saw. It's square enough to trim these down to size so I could keep my dado stack and my table saw, because once it's trimmed to size, I'm going to have to cut a dado for the front and the back of this as well. So I want to keep the handle and the old Maker's Mark stamp on there. I like stuff like that, but I'm going to put them in the back because you'll be less likely to get stuff hung up on this if it's in the back of the cabinet. So I just drew a straight line. I'm going to square up the back edge, and then I'm going to cut it to the exact width of my top. So front to back on these is 20 3/8. I'm going to cut these a little long, 20 1/2, to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. So I marked that on both of these, and I like to use a straight line, especially on that radial arm saw, because I'll be able to tell if my blade is tracking after making those adjustments by whether or not it follows this line. Also, brain fart, and I'm going to have to just make a cutout to fill in here. If I dado this front piece, it's going to cut through this gap here, and there'll be a hole, so I'm going to have to cut something to fill that. These to size, I'm going to cut that 1.25" groove in the front and the back. I could put them in place and mark where those legs meet, cut out those corners, and then these should plop right on their tops. So yesterday I cut and fit the first top to the table. I'm going to show you how I did that for the second top. So you can kind of see from the underside of this one that I did cut those a little bit wide to leave some space in case this does decide to move. You don't want it binding up on these edges, so that gives me a little bit of breather room on the underside. Also, that was allowed me to put this flat on the top. So I went around and I just eyed it for square. I made sure that the piece came up to the front of these edges, that there was going to be enough on either side, and that it went to the back as well. And I just eyed up the space to get it right. Then I didn't necessarily put a very long point on my pencil, but I shaved it back really far so it fits in between that wood, and I'm just going to go around and trace where those legs are. Now the reason I drew those on there instead of just measuring and cutting rectangles is because since these sides are still rough sawn, they're not perfectly square. So by doing this, I'll get a nice tight fit on the top. You could see how nice and tight all those corners are. For my 4 marks, I'm just going to take my handsaw and I'm going to ride that line the whole way, not going past it, and cut out all these corners. And then once that's done, I'll film without too much talking. You're going to have to, since these lines butt right up, there's a little bit of filing and sanding in order to get them to be a perfect, nice fit. So that's how I have that fitting on there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim off the tops of my legs. This is going to end up being flush. And the reason I kept the legs exposed like this is because they have a coffee table, which is in front of the couch, which these will be by, that has through tenons on the top. And even though these aren't through tenons, I thought having that exposed end grain would really kind of match and tie into the coffee table. So these are a little bit of a differing sizes. See, on this one I already trimmed that they kind of undulate in height. So on this one what I did was I trimmed off the bulk on my table saw, and I'll go back through, and all this is going to have to be sanded. I'll go back through and trim down the rest. But all I did for that was raise my blades, set my fence. It should probably be the same distance for this one, and I just lobbed off those top parts. Next, I'm going to cut and mount both bottoms. I'm going to be using 3/4 inch birch veneer ply because I usually have that on hand. And luckily both of my openings are the same. They're 17 3/4 by 12 3/4. So I'll cut out 2 slabs, and then I'll have to notch out the corners, but I'll probably just do that on my radial arm saw. And these all are the same height and width, so I'll just mark all the corners and cut those out and prop those into place. Notch these out on the table saw because it's going to give me the cleanest corner, and since the saw is a circle, it is going to cut into the bottom side of this a little bit, but that's not going to mess with the integrity of the piece. And in fact, this one I already have in place, you'll see I'm going to put runners across all the sides in order to hold this in place so it can't fall out, and it's going to completely cover these so you won't even see them. So with those done, I could just pop these bottoms into place. And the nice thing is my center partition here is actually a little proud of this base, so I could slide it right up to that partition. So that's what it looks like from the inside. Once you put those bottoms on, it will be nice and flush. And I just took some scrap pine I had and ripped it into 5/8 inch sections, and now with these 2 strips I could just measure and cut pieces to fit along each side. I'll put glue on the bottoms of them and then just tack them into place with some brads. Once everything's dry, I might go back and put some screws in, but it should be okay with just the glue and the brads. So that's what the bottom looks like when I'm finished, and I did spend the time to notch out these corners so that it's set flush against this bottom rail. You don't necessarily have to do that. Aesthetically, it just looks cleaner. So I don't know if you could see in the video, but as I was putting these on, I was using my fingers to feel on the inside here to make sure everything was flush. So it's kind of holding everything in place and just putting brads in there. I think the brads are going to be enough. I don't think I'm going to go back through and put screws in. And then when it's flipped upside down, you could see how nice that bottom looks. It fits in there perfectly. Nice and clean and flush, no big gaps.